The ferry was going down. 43 minutes of maritime first aid training, 0 minutes in an actual emergency at sea. And the only person moving toward the engine room was a 26-year-old woman who'd been told, twice by the crew, to sit down and stay out of the way. Her name was Nadège Fontaine-Obi. Most people called her Nadège. The crew of the MV Chestermere Spirit called her ma'am, in the tone people use when they mean something less polite. This is a story about what happened on the crossing from Sawasan to Duke Point on a Tuesday in late November. It is also a story about a grandfather who died before he ever got to see what his granddaughter was capable of. And it is a story about the particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with not being afraid, because Nadège was afraid. She will tell you that herself. She was terrified in the way that makes your hands shake, and your vision narrow to a single point. She moved anyway. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The Chestermere Spirit departed on schedule at 9:15 in the morning. The crossing to Nanaimo takes just under 2 hours on a clear day. That Tuesday, the sky over the Strait of Georgia was the color of old pewter, and the forecast had been calling for swells of 2 to 3 meters since the night before. Not unusual for late November, not cause for cancellation. BC Ferries runs in worse. Nadège had the window seat on the upper passenger deck, port side, 3rd row from the bow stairwell. She had chosen it deliberately. Old habit. She always chose seats close to exits without being so close that anyone would notice she was choosing seats close to exits. 8 years in the Canadian Forces does that to you. 2 tours, one in Latvia, one in Mali, and 4 years working force protection for a forward operating base outside Gao. She had been back in civilian life for 14 months. She was still working on sitting with her back to a door. She had a coffee from the cafeteria going cold in the cup holder beside her and a novel open on her lap that she had not read a single page of. She was watching the water. There were maybe 80 passengers on the sailing. A Tuesday morning in November was not peak season. A family with 3 small children sat 2 rows back. An older man in a Canucks hat was sleeping against the window opposite. A woman with a laptop was on a call in French, something about a contract deadline, and Nadège had been passively listening to her argue for the past 20 minutes in the way you do when you have nothing else to occupy your attention. The first sign that something was wrong was not dramatic. It never is. It was a sound. A low, rhythmic metallic knock from somewhere below the passenger deck. Not the regular engine hum Nadège had been unconsciously cataloging since they left the terminal, but something offbeat, something syncopated. She noticed it at 9:47 by her watch. She set down her novel. She listened. The second sign was the list. Small at first, maybe 2 degrees to starboard, the kind of lean you'd chalk up to the swell. But it didn't correct. It held. And then it deepened. The third sign was the smell. Diesel and something else underneath it. Something hotter. Nadège had her jacket on and her bag over her shoulder before the PA system crackled. The announcement, when it came, was a masterpiece of institutional understatement. The chief steward's voice, a man whose nameplate read Gareth, came over the speakers with the practiced calm of someone who has done many hours of passenger management training and 0 hours of actual emergency. He said there was a mechanical issue in the lower vehicle deck. He said passengers should remain seated. He said the crew had the situation under control. The ferry listed another 3 degrees. Nadège was already at the stairwell. She wasn't the only person moving. A man in a high-visibility vest, one of the vehicle deck crew, she'd later learn his name was Tobias Wren, came through the door from the lower level going the wrong direction. He was moving fast. His face was the color of wet concrete. "What's the source?" Nadège said. Not a question. She was already reading him. He blinked at her. "Ma'am, you need to go back to your seat. What's the source of the list?" She kept her voice flat and even. Same voice she'd used in Gao. Same voice that had gotten people moving when moving was the only thing standing between them and a much worse morning. Port side flooding, engine room. Where's your bilge alarm? He stared at her. How do you? I have a CF Maritime Safety Certificate, and I need to know what we're dealing with, right now. The look on his face shifted. Not from suspicion to trust, exactly. More from suspicion to the particular desperate relief of a man who has just realized that someone else in the room might know something he doesn't. Seacock fitting on the port engine cooling intake, he said. It failed. Lower vehicle deck is taking water. Chief engineer is. He stopped, started again. Chief engineer isn't responding. Pause on that. Really pause on that, because that's the sentence everything turns on. The chief engineer isn't responding. On a vessel with a flooding lower deck, on a 2-degree and worsening list, in the middle of the Strait of Georgia in November, the engineer who knows how to isolate the intake, who knows where the manual shut-off valves are, who knows the layout of the mechanical spaces below the waterline, isn't responding. Where is he? Nadège said. Engine control room. He was checking the pressure gauges when the fitting blew. The heat. Another stop. We can't raise him on comms. Nadège looked at the stairwell behind him. She looked at the life ring mounted on the wall to his left. She looked at the PA panel in the corridor. Get Gareth to get everyone in life jackets and move all passengers to the starboard muster stations, she said. Not an announcement. You go get him. You tell him to his face. And you do not use the word evacuate. Say precautionary muster. Say it calm. Can you do that? Tobias nodded. Good. What's the manual isolation valve location for the port cooling intake? Forward engineering compartment below the vehicle deck. Red-handled valve, aft bulkhead low. You'd have to. He looked at her bag, her jacket, the way she was standing. You'd have to go through the vehicle deck to get there. Nadège took a breath. I know, she said. There are moments in life where you become, without choosing it, the hinge. You don't choose to be the hinge. The hinge is chosen by the circumstances, by the particular alignment of who is present and what they know and what needs to happen in the next 4 minutes, or it doesn't happen at all. Nadège Fontaine-Obi did not walk down that stairwell because she was brave. She walked down it because she was the only person in the relevant part of that ferry who had the relevant information, and the information would be useless if she didn't move. That is what she would say later. That is the version she would tell people who asked. But here is what she didn't say, or didn't say easily. She walked down that stairwell because somewhere in the back of her mind was a voice that was not quite her own. It was older than her. It was patient. It said, "You know what to do. You were taught. Don't waste the teaching." Her grandfather, Clément Fontaine, had spent 31 years in the Royal Canadian Navy. He had served on HMCS Algonquin during the Cold War, done 3 NATO deployments in the North Atlantic, and retired as a petty officer 2nd class in 1991 with a service record that anyone who had actually read it would have called exceptional. Most people hadn't read it. He was a black man from Trois-Rivières who had entered the Navy in 1960, and exceptional service records have a way of staying quieter than they should when the person holding them is a black man from Trois-Rivières in 1960. He died when Nadège was 19, the year before she enrolled. He left her his Navy-issue logbooks, his HMCS Algonquin cap badge, and a small, spiral-bound notebook in which he had, over the course of 31 years, written down everything he thought was worth knowing about ships, the sea, and emergencies. The notebook was not organized. It jumped from celestial navigation to basic pipe fitting to what to do if you smell diesel below the waterline. He had not written it for her. He had written it for himself because that was how he learned, by writing things down. But she had read it front to back 4 times before she enlisted, and then a 5th time the night before she left for Mali, and she could, if pressed, tell you what page the section on seacock valve isolation was on. Page 47, left margin. His handwriting was very small. The vehicle deck was partially flooded, not catastrophically. Maybe 15 centimeters at the lowest point, and the water was cold enough to cut through her boots in seconds. The vehicle deck lights were on, but one bank had shorted, which left the forward section in a dimness that made it harder to read the layout. Vehicles were shifting on their restraints with the list, which added a noise component that pressed on the back of her neck in a way she did not enjoy. She moved forward along the starboard wall, away from the standing water pooling to port, picking her way between the bumpers of SUVs and transport vans. She almost missed him. The chief engineer, she would learn later. His name was Edward Lessard, 62 years old, 28 years on BC ferries, grandfather of 4, was on the deck behind the forward equipment locker, half sitting, half slumped against the locker base. Not unconscious, close to it. He had a burn along his left forearm where the failed fitting had blown hot coolant across his skin, and he had hit his head when he fell. He was awake enough to look at her when she crouched beside him. He was not awake enough to stand. "Monsieur Lessard," she said. She had seen the name on the engineering schedule posted in the stairwell. She filed things like that automatically. "I'm going to the forward compartment. Port cooling intake isolation. Red-handled valve on the aft bulkhead. Tell me if I'm wrong." He blinked, his eyes focused. "Red handle," he said. His voice was thick. "And the secondary shutoff above it. Green handle. Turn that first or the red won't seat properly." "Green first, then red." "Yes." He looked at her. "Who are you?" "I'm a passenger," she said. She found the valve access hatch in the forward bulkhead, low, just like the notebook said, just like Topias had said. The hatch was stiff, salt and time, and she had to use both hands and brace her boot against the wall to get it moving. The compartment behind it was cramped and hot and stank of burnt coolant. The valves were exactly where Edouard had said they'd be. Green first. It was tight. She gripped it with both hands, the metal biting into her palms, and turned. It moved. She turned it full and felt the click of the seat engaging. Red second. Easier now. She turned it until it stopped. She counted to 15. She put her hand flat against the intake pipe and felt it. Felt the pressure behind it, still present, then easing. She had done something right, or she had done something catastrophically wrong, and she would know in about 90 seconds. She counted to 90. The pipe was quiet. The flooding stopped in approximately 2 minutes. The vessel's pumps, which the crew had managed to engage from the bridge, began clearing the vehicle deck over the following 40 minutes. The list corrected slowly, then all at once, and the particular sensation of a vessel returning to even keel after a prolonged list is something Nadège would later describe as the most specific physical relief she has ever felt. It felt like a held breath being let out by something much larger than a human being. The Chestermere Spirit did not sink. All 81 passengers, she learned the count later, were brought to the starboard muster stations, fitted with life jackets, and in the event needed none of them. The vessel limped back to Tsawasan under reduced power with a Coast Guard escort. Edouard Lessard was evacuated by helicopter to Vancouver General Hospital, where he was treated for his burn and a mild concussion and released the following afternoon. He sent her a message through BC Ferries 3 weeks later. It said, "Thank you. I am told I have you to thank for the shutoffs. My wife thanks you as well." Nadège was in the vehicle lineup waiting to disembark when the ferry's senior officer, a woman named Commander Ingrid Rask, came and found her. Commander Rask was tall, precise, and looked like someone who did not misplace words. "I understand you went into the vehicle deck," Commander Rask said. "I did," Nadège said, "against crew instructions. Your crew member was effectively incapacitated and the instruction Eipler," she meant Tobias, agreed it was necessary. "I wouldn't characterize it as against." Commander Rask looked at her for a moment. "How did you know about the seacock isolation procedure?" Nadège thought about her grandfather, about a spiral notebook with small handwriting, about 31 years of service and a retirement medal that had taken 11 years longer than it should have to arrive at a house in Trois-Rivières, delayed in some administrative backlog that no one had ever fully explained, awarded to a man who by then could not walk to the door to receive it, and whose daughter received it on his behalf and put it in a box, and then, years later, gave the box to a 19-year-old girl who had not yet decided what she was going to do with her life. "My grandfather was Navy," Nadège said. "He kept good notes." Here is the thing about Clément Fontaine that almost no one knew, because almost no one had thought to look. In his 31 years of service, he had been nominated for 3 commendations that were never formally processed. A rescue operation off the Labrador coast in 1967, a flooding incident in the engine room of HMCS Skeena in 1973, a fire suppression action during a NATO exercise in the Norwegian Sea in 1981, 3 separate incidents, 3 separate nominations submitted through the proper channels, 3 separate cases where the documentation moved slowly, and then more slowly, and then stopped moving altogether, and Clément never pursued them because he was not, by nature, a man who pursued recognition. He did the thing that needed doing. He wrote it in his notebook. He moved on. His granddaughter did not know about the nominations until she was 28 years old, when she submitted a formal service records request to the Department of National Defense on behalf of her family, not expecting to find anything, just wanting to have the complete file. And the response came back with 3 annotation flags she didn't understand. She called the Veterans Affairs Office in Quebec City. She spent 4 phone calls in 6 weeks getting a clear answer. The answer, when it came, was that the nominations had existed, and that a procedural review completed in 2019 had flagged all 3 as legitimate commendations that had been lost in administrative transfers during departmental reorganizations in the 1970s and 1980s, and that the formal recommendation to process them posthumously had been sitting in a queue awaiting a ministerial signature. She received the commendations on his behalf on a Friday in March. Her mother came with her. They held the ceremony in a small conference room in a government building in Ottawa that had fluorescent lighting and a water-stained ceiling tile. There were 4 people present, including the 2 of them. Someone had put a small Canadian flag on the table. Nadège stood there in that room and thought about the spiral notebook. She thought about page 47. She thought about a ferry in the Strait of Georgia and a red-handled valve and cold water filling her boots. She thought about what it means to pass something down without knowing you are passing it down, without a ceremony, without a flag, without fluorescent lights. Just, here is what I learned. It is yours now. She didn't cry in the conference room. She waited until she was outside, in the cold, and then she stood with her mother on the sidewalk, and they held each other for a long time without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate. And they both knew it. The report that BC Ferries submitted to Transport Canada following the Chestermere Spirit incident contained on page 12 the following sentence. An unidentified passenger with apparent maritime emergency training entered the vehicle deck during the flooding event and manually isolated the port cooling intake, halting the ingress of seawater and likely preventing a cascading mechanical failure. The word unidentified is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Nadège had given her name to 3 separate crew members during the incident. Her name appeared in the passenger manifest. She is not difficult to find. But that is how these things go, sometimes. The person everyone overlooked becomes the one who stopped the worst from happening, and then the official record finds a way to describe them as unidentified, and life moves on, and the ferry is repaired and returned to service, and the people who were on it go back to their regular lives, and most of them don't think about it very often after a while. Nadège thinks about it. Not the incident itself, though she thinks about that too. She thinks about the moment on the vehicle deck when she put her hand flat against the intake pipe and felt the pressure easing. She thinks about counting to 90 in the dark with water in her boots, and the sound of vehicles shifting on their restraints, and the list still in the deck beneath her feet. She thinks about the fact that she was afraid, genuinely, physically afraid, in a way that she has not often been afraid since she left the forces, because civilian life does not usually ask you to do things in that key. She thinks about her grandfather going into the engine room of HMCS Skeena in 1973. She doesn't know the details of that incident. It wasn't in the notebook, just in the nomination record, just a dry administrative line. Engine room flooding, exceptional response under pressure, recommended for commendation. She doesn't know what he felt, standing in whatever the naval equivalent was of that vehicle deck moment. She doesn't know if he was afraid. She thinks he probably was. She thinks he probably moved anyway. The notebook is on her kitchen table right now. The window of her apartment in East Vancouver faces west, toward the water, and on clear days she can see the ferries moving across the strait. She doesn't look at them the way most people look at them, as a feature of the view, a slow, pleasant movement on the horizon. She looks at them the way she has always looked at things since Mali. She clocks them, reads their trim, notes the weather, calculates, and then she lets it go and drinks her coffee and gets on with her morning. But she keeps the notebook close. She always has. And somewhere in it, in handwriting that is very small and very careful, a man who should have been given 3 commendations and was given none of them down everything. He thought was worth knowing, about ships, about the sea, about what to do when the thing that everyone else is running from is the exact thing that someone needs to run toward. He didn't write it for her. He wrote it for himself. She has read it so many times that the pages are soft at the corners, and she knows, without looking, where to find every word.